So what I'd like to do now, and we've been kind of alluding to it as we've been going through this problem, is to talk more explicitly about production. And I'm going to start with the simplest model of production I can think of. And it's a classic kind of Robinson Crusoe model. So I'm going to think about a guy on an island, and he's got two plots of land. He's got plot A, and he can produce two products, bananas and oranges. And on plot A, he can produce 10 bananas or 5 oranges. Okay? And I say or he can mix the plot. He can use it 50% for each, in which if he used it 50-50, he would get 5 and 2.5. Or he can use any mixture he wants, right? He can split the plot up, but if he uses the whole plot for bananas, he gets 10. If he uses the whole plot for oranges, he gets 5. Or he can split the plot any way he wants and get some reduced fraction of each. Okay? People understand the technology. It's a very simple linear technology. Okay? Plot B, he can produce 15 bananas or 40 oranges. Okay? So that's his same thing. Okay? And now I want to think about what's his production possibility frontier. And that is, what are the combinations of bananas and oranges that he can produce? Well, it's pretty clear if he wants to produce oranges and only oranges, how much he can grow? Well, he can grow 45, right? Everybody understands it, right? If he only wanted to grow oranges, he clearly could grow 45 oranges. And if he wanted to grow only bananas, he could grow 25 bananas. Everybody agrees with that, right? I think I did that right. He could do one or the other. He could do 45 oranges, no bananas, 25 bananas, no oranges. What other possibilities does he have? If he wants to, let's take this, start from this point. If he wants to produce oranges, if he wants to produce oranges, where should he produce them? Why? Well, how much do oranges cost here? So on A, an orange costs how much? 2 bananas. And on B, and a banana costs how much? How about 1/2 of an orange? Right? Everybody agrees with that? What about on plot B? How much does an orange cost on plot B? 3/8 of a banana. And how much does a banana cost? Better be 8/3, right? So when I look at this plot as an economist, I would say bananas. Who's the low-cost producer of oranges? B. Low-cost producer of oranges. Who's the low-cost producer of bananas? Well, half is less than 8/3. Right? Those are my low-cost producers of each of the products. Could it have been the case that one of the plots was the low-cost producer of both? No, right? No, not strictly. They could have been equal cost on both, but there's no way you could be lower on both because these are just reciprocals of one another, right? So if 3/8 is less than 2, then 8/3 is bigger than 1/2. I mean, it just can't be any other way. And that's a really important idea. This is what economists call comparative advantage. Most people have heard of it. But it's a really important principle, and it's related to the discussion we just had, right? Bells should be going off The discussion we just had is exactly the same concept, right? It's like the bear again. It's like, it's not how good absolutely I am at growing bananas or oranges, right? If I made this 150, it wouldn't change anything in terms of who's the low-cost producer. If I made this 1,500, it wouldn't change anything, right? Because the low-cost producer is determined by what you have to give up to get something. That's the whole notion of cost, right, is what you give up. So there's two ways to be a low-cost producer of widgets. One is to be really good at widgets. The other is just to be really bad at everything else, right? That's either one will work, right? And sometimes people have low cost because they're really good at one thing. Sometimes they have low cost, they're really bad at other stuff. Either one happens. Both happen in the world, right? Like the low-cost producer of sheep is not the land that can produce the most sheep per acre. It's the land that can't be used for much of anything else is the low-cost producer of sheep, okay? Right? So the comparative advantage is a key concept. And the notion of cost, remember, is what you give up, what you have to give up to get something. So if we're going to produce oranges, we're going to start producing them on plot B. And in fact, we're going to produce them on plot B until we can't produce any more. And so we're going to go to some point 4010, which is here. We would come down like this, and the slope here would be equal to what? Minus 3/8, right? Because it says for every banana we want to orange we want to produce, we're giving up 3/8 of a banana. And then from this point forward, the slope would be minus 2. Because we'd be giving up now 2 bananas per orange. So we'd have this convex production possibility frontier, which reflects what we say in economics, a rising marginal cost. The marginal cost of producing oranges is rising as we produce more oranges. Why is it rising in this model? No, yeah, you use the lowest cost first, right? That is, two features are important. One is there's heterogeneity in these resources. All the plots are not the same. I got some plots that have a comparative advantage in oranges, some plots have a comparative advantage in bananas, and I use the lowest cost plot first. Viewed either way. I use the lowest cost orange plot to produce the oranges, and I use the lowest cost banana plot to produce the bananas. That's an important source of rising marginal cost for many industries, particularly for industries that use natural resources. It's important in the oil business, for example. We talked about that already, where the cost of getting oil is increasing as we try to produce more because we have to go to places where it's higher and higher cost to produce. Okay? It's important in sports and other things where you're using human resources that are very heterogeneous. All right, so now if we had 3 plots of land, obviously we would end up with something that looks like that. And if we had a ton of plots of land, we might end up with some nice smooth production possibility frontiers. So the idea of heterogeneous resources would be an important concept of deciding where, of determining our PPF. We have these heterogeneous resources. We order them from lowest cost to highest cost. That gives us our nice convex shape. The more heterogeneous they are, the more curved this thing's going to be, right? If they're very similar, it'll be very straight. If they're very different, it'll be very curved. And if Robinson Crusoe was by himself, he would find a tangency with his indifference curve, and that would be his equilibrium point, right? Just pretty straightforward. He'd decide where he wants to consume oranges and bananas. That would be his equilibrium point. And the equilibrium price of oranges would be that slope, right? That slope would measure the equilibrium price of oranges on this guy's island. His income would be, in oranges, his income would be over here. That would be his real income in oranges. His real income in bananas would be over here, right? So you can think about income, prices, all that stuff, even though he's on an island by himself. Okay? All right. So I got this guy. He lives on an island by himself. He's selling. He's got his optimal production point and his optimal consumption, and suddenly he's allowed to join NAFTA. Okay, so guys from NAFTA say, we got the North American free trade, and even though you're not in North America, we'll let you in. And they're going to send him a letter in the mail telling him what it means to be a member of NAFTA. And what does it mean to be a member of NAFTA in this model? What are they going to send you? They're going to send you a letter. And what's going to be in that letter? Well, terms of trade. How many numbers? 2? How about 1? Can they economize on ink and send them one number, which is the price of, pick it, oranges or bananas, expressed in terms of the other good. They're going to say, in the world market, you could trade oranges for bananas at some rate. In the NAFTA market, you can trade it. Okay, so now it's like Christmas morning. He's waiting there for the letter to come. What's he thinking? What does he want? What's he hoping for when he opens that letter? Yeah. Little different? Yeah, as much different as possible, right? That's what he wants. He wants bananas to either be a lot more expensive than where he is, or he wants it to be a lot cheaper, right? Now he might have a slight preference for which one, depending on where his comparative advantage is, but the worst possible letter he could possibly get would be the price he already has, right? Because if we got the price he already has, he'd be no better off than he is right now. But do you understand that? That if he got the same, if the letter when he opened it said this is the price, he'd say, geez, thanks very much, but I already had that price. You guys didn't help me. All right? So, let's assume that the NAFTA price of oranges is higher than his. Okay? So here's his picture. He was tangent here. The NAFTA price is higher, which means the slope in the NAFTA world is steeper, right? That's what it means to have a higher price of oranges. So what's he going to do? Well, he's going to want to shift his production, because think about what he's doing here. When he was by himself, he was producing where the marginal cost of oranges, which is the slope of his PPF, that's how much it costs to produce additional oranges, was equal to the marginal value of oranges, which was the slope of his indifference curve, right? So this was marginal cost equals marginal value. But he kind of had this constraint that he had to produce whatever he wanted to consume. When you are allowed to trade, he can now separate his choice of what to produce from his choice of what to consume, because he can trade to make up the difference. So in my example, what he'd want to do is he'd want to shift his production toward oranges. In fact, he'd want to go to the point where the slope of this trade line, this is the trade line, slope equals minus price of oranges in NAFTA. Right? That's what it is. That's the price of oranges. He would produce here orange star production, banana star production, and then he would trade with other people in NAFTA to get to a higher indifference curve up here. orange star consumption, banana star consumption. Right? What are the implications of this framework for thinking about the world? What do you see in this picture that's important? Yeah. So I would call that a theory of the firm. That is, we could, in this example, talk about a firm as owning this production process and a firm as choosing that point. And what allows me to think of this as a theory of the firm is I don't have to know who this guy is to know he's going to pick that point. That is, regardless of what indifference curves this fella has, he's always going to want to produce here, no matter who owns it. You understand why that's a theory of the firm? Because we're going to be able to talk about firm behavior without talking about who the owner is. We're going to say, this firm is going to maximize profits, or this firm is going to maximize value, whatever it is. In this simple competitive marketplace, where they can buy and sell oranges in this market, this NAFTA market, this is where people are going to produce, regardless of who it is. If I owned it, you owned it, he owned it, doesn't matter who owns it. Everybody would make the same choice. Would it be what? Yeah, I guess, yeah. It's the same idea, right? It's the idea is we can simply think about the producers, and we're going to do this through most of the quarter. We're going to talk about suppliers as firms without saying who owns them. We're just going to abstract from the ownership. Because the concept is whoever owns it is going to want to be here. Okay? So that's one thing we learn from this graph. What else do we learn? Yeah, that's another good one. Trade is good. That's exactly how I would say it. Trade is good. Right? That is, this is another fundamental piece of economics. That's, you ask why I do such a simple model. The reason I do this really simple model is it produces some very important results in economics. Like you have a theory of the firm. Why we talk about profit maximization. Number two, trade is good. He's better off. Right? All right? And the gains in trade come most, or biggest, the more different the world price is from your price, right? Price difference implies gains to trade. And you can see clearly in this example that the steeper we make this, the better off he's going to be, right? As I make it steeper and steeper, he's going to get better off. And if I go back the other way, he's going to get worse and worse off until he gets no gains from trade. And then the flatter I make it from that point on, the better off he's going to be, right? So it's monotonic in that direction, right? He's going to gain a lot when the willingness to pay. Now, everybody should be like looking back and saying, you know that example he was talking about with like the poor guys and all that stuff? People see how that's related to this? If you don't, go home and think about it. Because it's very similar. It's very much the same economics that we were talking about there. Okay? Any other questions that people have? Anything else? How about a competitive firm produces where price equals marginal cost? Right? That's this tangency right here. That's saying he's going to keep producing oranges to the point where the marginal cost of an orange is equal to the market price of an orange. Okay? And you also can get, there's a bunch of other stuff. Marginal cost equals marginal value, right? That is his slope here is the same as his slope here. Both equal to marginal cost equal to marginal value. They're not at the same point, but in equilibrium, his marginal value of oranges will be equal to his marginal cost of oranges. That was true when he was by himself and continues to be true when he can trade in this world market. Okay? Well, let's think about then, now that we have the idea of a firm, let's think about how a firm would behave. So, how does a firm behave? Well, there's a couple of models we can use. We can think about a simple production problem. In my production problem, I'm going to think about what we'll call a production function. It's kind of like a utility function, but it's a little different, and we'll explain why. Production function, we'll think output, we'll call that y, inputs x1 up to xn. So our inputs are kind of like our goods that we had in our production problem, in our utility maximization problem, sorry. And we have y equals f of x1 up to xn. It simply says the amount of output I produce is a function of the amount of each of the inputs I put in. Now, one thing I should emphasize that often we don't talk much about in economics is this production function itself is the result of maximization already. Right? Everybody understands that. This is the maximum amount of output I can get from these inputs. Right? I've already kind of incorporated the idea that I'm using these inputs efficiently and producing the maximum output I can from a given set of inputs. I mean, it's not like it magically happens, right? Everybody understands this, right? Everybody ever baked a cake, right? Even if you had all the ingredients in the oven, if you didn't put them together right, you wouldn't end up with a cake, right? You just end up with a mess, right? Everybody understands just having all the inputs isn't sufficient to produce the output. Now, you might say, well, there's really another input, which is managerial skill or baker's skill or whatever it is. But even if you had the skill, if you didn't use it, you wouldn't get the output. The point is, there's a lot of interesting stuff that goes behind the production function itself, right? Economists like to start with the production function, but in truth, there's a lot of maximization that's already gone on. How do I get the most out of the inputs I have? And we'll come back later and talk about technological progress, which can be thought in some ways as getting more outputs from the same amount of inputs. Okay, that's one way to think about technological progress, is improvements in this production function. And why can this production function change? Because it's itself the subject of maximization, right? Okay? All right. So that's my model. I'm going to assume you're a competitive firm. What do I mean by a competitive firm? What I mean is there's a price of output and there's prices of inputs that I don't affect. I'm a price taker in the market, just like my guy on the island was in NAFTA. So P is going to be the price of output. W1 up to Wn are the prices of the inputs. Think W standing for like the wage of the inputs. It's the price of the inputs. Okay? And now what's the difference so far with this in utility theory? Is there a difference already? Yeah. Well, that's part of it, but even more fundamentally, we can directly measure the output here, right? So there are two real, that's almost a separate issue, right? One is let's just say utility was ordinal, but I couldn't measure it. Well, then I would, right? So That's part of the issue. So one of the big issues, I think, in fact, the biggest issue I think of is that I can measure output, right? So that's something I couldn't do with utility. I had to infer utility, what was going on with utility. Even if it was cardinal, I would have to infer it from his behavior. I couldn't look at and see, well, geez, here's the goods he's consuming, and I got my little utility meter that measures his utility. Here I look at the output of his factory, and I can see how many widgets are coming out, right? I can actually see the output, so I can measure the output. Now, in addition to being ordinal, the other point is, and let me go a little further and we'll see where this comes in. So we're going to assume this guy's going to maximize profits. Okay? Why does the firm maximize profit? Why is that a reasonable assumption? Or maybe it's not. Gary Becker often would say it wasn't a reasonable assumption. I actually think it is I think it's for many problems a very reasonable assumption. Why in our context would we want to maximize profit? Yeah. Right. That is, if I own the firm, I want to maximize utility. But if the way I get utility is spend the profits, then I'm better off if I have more profits. And we would all agree, no matter who owns it, they all want to have more money to spend. Now, if you tell me I care about other things about how the firm operates, like I enjoy having lots of capital or I enjoy other things, well, then that model's not a good model. It may be missing out on important things, but it may be a good first approximation to assume that the guy doesn't care about those things. What he cares about is how much money he ends up with. What is profit? It's just revenue minus cost. Right? That's what we mean by profit, because that's what you get to take home with you at the end of the day. So, yeah. Well, no, he's not saying it's not a good idea. He's not telling people they shouldn't maximize profits. He's in many problems said, well, owners of firms may care about other things, like who they hire, how famous they are. Like if I wanted, and I think it really depends on the problem you have at hand. If I wanted to understand the implications of a corporate income tax, probably I would focus mostly on profit maximization. If I wanted to understand owners in the National Basketball Association, that's probably not exactly the right model, because the owners often want to win. They're not just about ending up at the season with the most money. They also enjoy winning. They're very rich people who consume. They also might enjoy interacting with certain players or other things like that, right? So now if you want to study discrimination, you might think that maybe owners care about the employees that they hire. They dislike hiring some employees relative to others, and that was, Gary's dissertation was about that. So he sort of deviated from the profit maximization, pure profit maximization. He said, well, I got to go back to the utility maximizing problem that says maybe I care about profits, but maybe I care about other things too. I never heard Gary say people didn't care about profits. He just often would say they care about profits, but maybe they care about some other things as well. I think if you told him you got to ignore everything but one variable, he would have come back and said, I'll focus on profits. So I think he wouldn't disagree that that would have been the first thing he listed in his utility function for the owners, but he maybe wouldn't stop there. I think that's a fair way to put it. Okay? All right. Then there might be a conflict.
Yeah, so profit maximization is an unambiguous object that everyone agrees, but as for the kind of other things, how can you
Yeah, that's why sometimes you get battles over ownership, right? So, for example, like founders of firms, sometimes they get thrown out because they want to They don't necessarily want to do what maximizes profits. There was their company. They started it. They want to see it stick around and maybe stay in the industry they started in, even if it's no longer profitable to stay in that industry. And, you know, if they got billions of dollars because they were very successful in the past, they may be willing to spend a fair amount. The problem is if they only own part of the company, they're probably spending other people's money at the same time, and that creates a conflict, right? So, no, that's a real-world situation that comes up, is conflict between the multiple owners. And, you know, Founders is a good example about that. I mean, people have studied this. I mean, I think some people have found that some firms go up in value when the founder dies. Some firms go down in value when the founder dies. Just depends. I mean, is he like a super talented person who's the reason why the firm's so valuable? Or is he really a dead weight it's not unreasonable to have a sudden death of the founder actually cause the firm to go up in value because people realize they're no longer going to do these things that were good from his point of view, even though they weren't good from a shareholder point of view. So, you know, that's where you'd have to deviate. But I think most economics focuses on profit maximization that's really the model that we get the most mileage from. And that's what we're going to do most of the time, okay? So revenue is PY, and cost is just the sum of the XI, WI, I equals 1 to N, right? That's my profit maximization. That implies I'm going to max PF of X1 up to Xn minus sum of the WI XI. Okay? I equals 1 to N. Now this looks like a lot like our utility maximization problem with a very important difference. What is that? What's different? Why is it different? Anybody ever thought about that? Why is this problem different than the utility maximization problem? Why couldn't I just replace PY with just U? Why couldn't I put a U here? Yeah. Yeah, well, yes. It's actually the... Yeah, what is it though? It's because you can trade the output, right? You can... Like the thing I couldn't do is like, let's assume I was like really great at producing utility, right? Say I was like had the greatest utility machine in history, right? And I was just really good at like producing utility. So I could take goods and transform them into enormous utility. And assume utility was something you could quantify. Biologists could measure like, man, that's a lot of utility, okay? Would that turn that, that's what I'm saying. Let's assume it could be measured and it was quantitative and all these other ideas. It was ordinal. Would that make that problem into this one? That's the key, is I can't trade the output, right? That is, I can't say, I'll give you my goods, you produce a bunch of utility with it, and then trade them back to me, right? That's what we can do with the output that we couldn't do with utility. That really has nothing to do with it not being ordinal, and it has nothing to do with it not being measured. It's that it's not transferable. You can't trade it. You can't like say, I'm going to produce all the utility where some guys are really good at watching TV. So we're going to let them watch TV. And other people are really good, at doing something else. We'll let them do that, and then we'll trade the utility. We can do that in production. I can be really good at making widgets, and you can be really good at making something else, and we specialize in production. But the production of utility is intrinsic to consumption. That's what we're assuming. Now, we've been able to move more and more goods into the marketplace, right? That is, you don't have to produce as much for yourself as you did before. If we get into a kind of household production view of the world, then you actually can move things out of what we would call utility, which is all the things that happen maybe in the household, into the marketplace. And so that is a more realistic phenomenon. But fundamentally, the whole idea of satisfaction is it doesn't have this objective measure. It's not something, it's ordinal, not cardinal. Number two, it's not directly measurable. And number three, it's not transferable. Whereas this output is all three of them. It's ordinal, it's measurable, and it's transferable. And that's what really separates the production problem from the utility problem. People get the idea? And that's why when we made that where to live problem into a production problem, it got so much more traction, right? Because it just turned it into like, how do I produce where to live at the cheapest cost, right? Well, that's like we were saying before. You could work in a factory or you could work in your car by driving. And you just were using that resource wherever it was the most productive. That's what was going on there.